class we were discussing the Enlightenment, and in particular the movement that grew out of it, neoclassicism. We had seen how the work on the left by Jacques-Louis David reflected the tenets of neoclassicism, but also how, even though it was made in 1784, it came to be seen after the French Revolution as being a symbol for the revolution. It certainly tapped into feelings at that time, this exemplum virtutis, on how to look to the past for examples on how to behave morally in the present. Ancient Rome providing an example for swearing in oaths to fight for a higher cause, picked up by the revolutionaries. So when David is asked to commemorate the revolution, the swearing of the oath to the revolution, he borrows from the oath of the Hirati, as the Frenchmen swear to fight unto the death for a higher cause. Remember that these two works were displayed side by side in the Salon of 1789, the official Royal Academy show, and so that relationship of past to present was made clear to everyone. This particular screencast will focus on the art and politics of this era, the French Revolution and immediately following it, and in particular Jacques-Louis David being at the center of that. Because of the portrait of the oath at the tennis court, David became friends with the revolutionary leaders, and he was a first-hand witness to all of the major events of French history during this troubled time. On the left, a sketch made on site as Marie Antoinette was wheeled toward the guillotine, tied her hands behind her back, dressed like a peasant, dethroned. David saw this, made a quick sketch as she wheeled by. He was a witness to history and closely affiliated with the most important figures of the French Revolution. This portrait in your text, The Death of Marat, was painted in 1793. 1793 was the year that came to be known as the Terror. This is when the revolutionaries were executing as many of the old aristocracy as they could, deploying the guillotine in every Place de la République, in every town in France. The streets literally ran with blood. And there was some public sentiment against the revolutionaries, the stark violence of their actions. And to combat this, the revolutionaries wanted images showing the deaths of their fallen leaders. And Jacques-Louis David's Death of Marat is a picture that is meant to serve as a reminder that the revolutionaries had been killed as well. And in fact, there were engraved copies made after it, circulated widely, commissioned by the different revolutionaries to remind people that while there was violence in the streets against the old aristocracy, the aristocracy was not without guilt itself. So this image falls directly into that category. So who is Marat? He was a hero to the revolutionary cause. Prior to the revolution, he was a journalist, a very popular, well-read journalist, whose writings helped to stoke the revolutionary cause. He had been writing about the fact that civil rights were something that every man should expect, that it wasn't reserved only for the aristocracy, but was for, civil rights were for the common man as well. In this image, we see a part of his biography that was very important. Marat had a very bad case of eczema, scaly, dry, painful skin. And this forced him to spend hours in a bath that was filled with ointments to salve the chafing and dried skin. At the same time, this never stopped him from working. And as you can see in this picture, he set up a nifty little table where he could continue to write despite the hardship. That's part of David's message, is that despite he believed in his cause to the degree that, despite the physical hardship, he continued to write for the common man, to advocate for their rights. It was exactly these writings that got Marat murdered. The old aristocracy sent an agent to Marat's house who stabbed him while he was in the bath working. Here we see David paints the wound to his chest. This is accurate. This is where he was indeed stabbed. David was allowed into the crime scene. He's close with everyone, as I mentioned before. And so the portrait of Marat is taken from a drawing that David did at the crime scene. And he gets accurate the placement of the wound on his chest. The painting, in addition to this accuracy of detail, is also intended to suggest that his writings will outlive him, that the pen is mightier than the sword, that old adage. And he puts Marat's quill pen immediately next to the knife that killed him. Marat may die, but his writings will live on. His ideas survive any attempt to silence them. Furthermore, the murderer is implicated in a letter of introduction. The way that the murderer got into David's house was to simply say that she wanted to talk to him. Her name was Charlotte Corday, and here we see her letter of introduction on the 13th of July, 1793. Marie-Anne Charlotte Corday to the citizen Marat. It would be sufficient if I had the honor of your presence. She simply wants to talk to him. And being a man of the people, he thinks this is okay, and she comes in and of course, murders him, having gotten that entrance. So she is there. Now, what David wants to do is not only to show that the members of the revolutionaries had also suffered and died as part of the cause, implicating the murderer here with the bloody fingerprints on the letter, but also, and this is typical for neoclassicism, in order to amplify the degree of his sacrifice for the good of mankind, David draws in earlier works of art and bases the image of Marat on Christ, that slung arm over the side of the tub, directly follows on very famous examples that David certainly knew of Christ after his sacrifice. This is intended to help the message that the revolutionaries want to get across, is that Marat died for the freedom of mankind. Well, French history was rather troubled. The original revolution of 1789 led to the Terror in 1793, which led to some certain backlash against the revolutionaries. The revolution was always fraught by problems between the extreme left and the more moderate parts of the party. In 1799, there was a parliamentary coup by one of the generals of the French army, Napoleon Bonaparte. David had met him already on a number of occasions, painted his portrait while he was only a general before he was leading this parliamentary coup. And so this unfinished portrait on the right, a very early portrait of Bonaparte, unfinished, and before the coup was mounted. So, 1799, Bonaparte mounts a coup to take over the revolutionary government. From that point forward, David becomes Napoleon's portraitist of choice. The famous Napoleon crossing the Alps, showing one of Napoleon's achievements, crowning achievements, crossing the Alps from Italy back to France, his triumphal return, commemorated by David on a number of different occasions. There's about 10 different versions of this painting. When Napoleon was finally crowned emperor, David was called on to paint the massive canvas that commemorated Napoleon's coronation. He'd gone from the usurping leader of the revolution to now the emperor of France. And so in this picture we see Napoleon here in the center, after having received his crown, placing a crown on the head of his wife Josephine. In the National Gallery we have another portrait of Napoleon by David. Again, David was his favorite portraitist. This is well after his coronation as emperor, but you can see he is still dressed as a colonel. He still wants himself shown as a colonel. This is part of what David is trying to get across here, is an idea. He shows Napoleon having been up all night. It's 4:13 in the morning. And he's been up all night working on his new code of law, but he's about to rise as he hears the revelry of the troops, and he's going to go review them as they come out for their morning review. So he's still a general, still in charge of the military, but also working hard for the good of France. Even at 4 in the morning, he's been up all night. He's not tired. No insomnia here. If we look at the desk, here we can see a candle that is burned all the way to the bottom as a symbol of his hard work through the night. On his desk here, you can see the code of law that he's been busily writing, something he's doing entirely himself. Now, David, like I said, was the favorite portraitist of Napoleon. He had other artists working for him as well. And Jean-Antoine Gros, who was a pupil of David's, was his go-to painter for battle scenes, scenes of his military victories. And as you can see, this is an absolutely massive work, almost 24 feet across the base. The figures are roughly life-size as they appear within the picture. It shows a event from Napoleon's failed attempt to conquer Egypt. This is one of his failures, but what he wants to show is how a failure can turn into a success. So rather than showing him in Egypt, where his attempt to conquer Egypt met with failure, here a painting from 60 years later, actually 70 after the fact, where Napoleon encounters the Sphinx sitting silent in the desert. But, this is not what Gros shows. What Gros wants to show, not the defeat in Egypt, his inability to conquer Egypt, but what Gros wants to show during Napoleon's lifetime is his success. And so what he ends up showing here is a shift in focus. After losing Egypt, Napoleon shifted his armies to what is present-day Israel, and his forces raid the city of Jaffa. Now, we know this is Jaffa from not only the title of the painting, but we can see the French flag having been raised on the hill in the background, the smoke of cannon fire in the air, and they've converted this mosque. We're in the courtyard of the mosque here, has been converted into a hospital for the military dead. But Napoleon's forces have slaughtered the inhabitants, raised their flag. And while this took place, among Napoleon's own troops, the plague broke out. And so this is why they converted a mosque into a military hospital, a makeshift military hospital, was to house Napoleon's own troops. And this shows the moment when Napoleon, unafraid of catching the plague himself, goes and visits his own troops who have been afflicted by the plague. And he reaches out to touch them, his gloves off, certainly putting himself in great danger of catching what they have. This image of Napoleon surrounded by the dead and the dying, the weak and the maimed, certainly brings up a number of different images of Christ. We looked at Rembrandt's 100 Guilder print, where Christ is asking for the crippled to come to him to be healed by his touch. Gros is picking up on this idea, almost as if Napoleon can heal by his touch. Of course he can't, but if we go back to political theology from the Middle Ages, French kings in the Middle Ages were believed to be able to heal by their touch. And Gros is sort of picking up on that idea and making Napoleon almost a Christ-like figure coming to save his troops single-handedly. At the same time, he wants to humanize Napoleon. And so while on one hand he seems like Christ, on the other hand, by touching the side of that figure who raises his arm, Napoleon is also very much like Thomas, who says, I have to see it, I have to touch the wounds to believe. Going back to this Renaissance sculpture by Leonardo da Vinci's teacher, Verrocchio. And you can see the degree to which Napoleon's figure is modeled after St. Thomas as he touches the side of Christ. So Gros, like many other neoclassical artists, is really picking up on this idea of turning back to art of the past to enhance the meaning of the work. Napoleon appears Christ-like on one hand, but very humane, very human